They say a duke chooses his duchess the way a man selects a sword, for its brilliance, its sharpness, its power to impress the room. They say he looks for beauty that commands attention, for wit that sharpens conversation, for a lineage that strengthens alliances. No one, in all the long history of English society, had ever said that a duke might choose the woman standing half behind a doorway, pouring tea with steady hands and downcast eyes. As though she had already decided she was not part of the selection. But that is precisely what happened on a grey Tuesday morning in October, in the drawing-room of Ashvale Park, when the Duke of Thornmere looked past two perfectly presented daughters, one radiant, one accomplished, and said, quietly and without ceremony, that he would have the third. Not because she was beautiful. Not because she had spoken a single word in his presence. But for a reason he would not explain and she would not ask. She was Miss Cecily Aston. The youngest. The plain one, everyone said. The one who handled the household accounts when their father could not, who sat with the sick cook through a fever, who had long since learned to make herself useful rather than ornamental. She accepted his proposal with a nod and returned to the tea service. What she did not know, on that quiet October morning, was that the Duke's choice was not kindness. It was not admiration. It was, in its own cold way, the beginning of the deepest wound she had ever been asked to survive. And also, though neither of them could have known it then, the beginning of the only true home either of them had ever been offered. The Duke of Thornmere was 34 years old, and he was tired. Not tired in the way of men who have worked too hard or slept too little. He was tired in the deeper, quieter way of a man who has spent a decade being exactly what everyone required of him, commanding officer, loyal subject, obedient heir, solvent landlord, and had discovered, somewhere along the miles of obligation, that he no longer quite remembered who he was beneath all of it. His name was Edmund Ratcliffe. He had fought in the later campaigns on the continent. He had returned to inherit a dukedom in debt, a crumbling ancestral estate in the north, and a mother who handed him a list of marriageable daughters the same week he arrived home. He had handled all of it with the same clipped efficiency he brought to everything. He had managed the debt. He had stabilized the estate at Thornmere Hall, or at least stopped its bleeding. And now he was expected to produce an heir, which required, first, a duchess. The Aston family was respectable but not exceptional. Sir Herbert Aston had connections Edmund's solicitor found useful. And a modest but unencumbered estate that could be folded into certain property arrangements Edmund's lawyers were negotiating in the north. The eldest daughter, Miss Arabella, was considered the great beauty of the county. The second, Miss Harriet, played pianoforte with the kind of practiced brilliance that made visiting mothers clutch their hearts. Edmund had been told of both of them at length. He had not been told of Cecily. When he arrived at Ashvale Park, Arabella met him at the threshold in pale blue muslin, her dark hair dressed in elaborate ringlets. She smiled at him with the confidence of a woman who had been told all her life that she was enough simply by arriving. Harriet stood beside her, pink-cheeked and animated, speaking before he had even settled into his chair about a sonata she had been learning and whether he appreciated Beethoven. Edmund answered both of them. He was civil. He was appropriate. He was also, privately, exhausted before the teacups were filled. And then he noticed the third woman. She had entered from a side door and crossed to the tea table with such quiet economy of movement that she seemed to have simply materialized there. She wore grey, not fashionable grey, but practical grey, the grey of a woman who dressed for work and not for notice. Her hair was brown and simply arranged. Her face was fine-boned but unremarkable, pleasant without being arresting. She poured tea with the focus of a person engaged in something important, not something ornamental. She did not look at him. In a room full of people performing for him, she was the only one not performing. He watched her for 4 minutes before he spoke to his solicitor. His solicitor looked alarmed. His solicitor said, very quietly, that Miss Cecily Aston was considered the least of the 3 daughters, that she had no particular accomplishments, that she was 26. Which was rather long in the tooth for a first presentation, and that surely Edmund could not be serious. Edmund was serious. He crossed the room and stood beside the tea table and said, Miss Aston, not to Arabella or Harriet but to the woman in grey. I believe we have not been introduced. Cecily looked up. Her eyes, he noticed, were a very clear, steady grey, not unlike the dress. She said, No, Your Grace, we have not. I am the sister who pours the tea. He almost smiled. He could not quite say why. The engagement was announced 2 days later. Arabella cried for an afternoon and then recovered with impressive speed and transferred her attentions to a baronet. Harriet declared it deeply unfair and played Beethoven with considerable violence for a week. Sir Herbert Aston shook Edmund's hand and looked vaguely bewildered. Cecily said nothing of consequence to anyone. She went to the kitchen garden and sat among the winter cabbages for a long time, and then she came in, and she made a list. She was practical that way. She had always been practical. The wedding was small and occurred in November. Edmund gave her a ring that had belonged to his grandmother. He told her, on the morning of their wedding, in a tone that was not unkind but was wholly without warmth, that he expected she would be installed at Thornmere Hall in the north. That he would visit when estate business required it, that she would have an allowance and authority over the household, and that he trusted she understood the arrangement. She said she understood the arrangement. He did not kiss her after the ceremony. He shook her hand, briefly, as though they had concluded a negotiation. Which, she supposed, they had. He left for London 2 days later. His carriage disappeared down the frost-edged drive at first light, and Cecily stood at the upstairs window and watched it go, and felt nothing so dramatic as heartbreak, only a clean, cold clarification of exactly what her life was now going to be. She turned from the window, straightened her shawl, and went to find the housekeeper. Thornmere Hall had not been loved in a long time. Cecily understood this within the first hour of her arrival. The carriage had deposited her at the top of a long gravel drive in the last light of a November afternoon. And the house had risen before her like something that had given up trying to look welcoming. The stone was dark with years of northern weather. One wing appeared largely unoccupied. Several windows on the east face were boarded. The gardens, what she could see of them, were indeterminate tangles, as though the plants had held a quiet conference and decided to proceed without human guidance. Inside was no more encouraging. The housekeeper, a woman called Mrs. Pruitt, was capable and not unfriendly, but her manner carried the particular exhaustion of someone who had been managing with insufficient resources for too long. The footmen were 2 in number where 8 had apparently once served. The fires were built small, from what Cecily suspected was careful rationing of coal. The east corridor smelled persistently of damp. Cecily asked for the household accounts on her second morning. Mrs. Pruitt produced them with visible relief, as though she had been waiting for someone to ask. What Cecily found was not ruin, Edmund had prevented that, but it was not health either. The household ran on reduced income, reduced staff, and reduced expectation. The gardens produced nothing useful because no one had been told to make them useful. The tenant farms on the northern parcel were managed by a steward who was competent but had not received clear direction in some time and had accordingly begun making conservative decisions that were slowly strangling output. Cecily sat with the accounts until her candle burned low and made 3 columns, what could be fixed immediately, what could be fixed with patience, and what required the Duke's authority to address. The 3rd column was the shortest. She had not expected that. She sent a brief, factual letter to Edmund in London, outlining her initial observations. She was careful to phrase it as information rather than complaint. Because she understood instinctively that he was not a man who would respond well to a wife who arrived somewhere and immediately found fault. She noted the reduced coal supply and the state of the East Corridor, mentioned the steward's lack of direction as a question rather than a criticism, and signed it with her name and nothing more personal than that. He wrote back 12 days later. 1 paragraph. He thanked her for the letter and instructed her to use her judgment regarding the household. The steward's name was Hargreaves and she might direct him as she thought appropriate. He was, he said, occupied with parliamentary matters and expected to be in London through February. Cecily read the letter twice. She folded it with care and put it in the writing desk. Then she sent for Hargreaves. What followed was not dramatic. Drama was something Cecily had never much trusted as an instrument of actual change. What followed was steady, incremental, and deeply unglamorous. She met every member of the household staff within the first week. She learned their names and their situations. She discovered that the hall had once employed a full kitchen garden under a head gardener who had retired 3 years ago and not been replaced. She found his records in the estate library, detailed planting diagrams, soil notes, frost calendars, and spent several evenings reading them beside the fire with a cup of weak tea. Learning a dead man's knowledge of living earth. She hired 2 women from the village who knew kitchen gardens and paid them a modest but fair wage from the household budget. She redirected part of the fuel expenditure to repair the East Corridor's most damaged window, which was cheaper than continuing to heat the rooms that the corridor's draft was actively cooling. Small economies made larger ones possible. She wrote to Edmund monthly. Her letters were always factual and always polite. She told him about the garden's first winter preparations, about a dispute between 2 tenant farmers that Hargreaves had brought her, about the cook's Christmas pudding that had required a particular brandy she hoped he could supply from London. She did not ask him when he was coming. She did not express loneliness, though she felt it, deeply and privately, in the long evenings when the fire settled and the house breathed around her and she was utterly, thoroughly alone in a place that was hers in name only. He answered every letter. His replies were brief, informative, and always began with, "Dear Cecily," in a hand that was controlled and slightly formal. He sent the brandy. He approved of the garden arrangements. He mentioned, once, that Parliament was more taxing than anticipated, and that he hoped the winter in the north was not proving too severe. She wrote back that the winter was precisely as severe as one might expect of the north, and that she found she rather preferred honesty in a landscape. He did not reply to that letter for 3 weeks. When he did, he said only that he found her observation interesting, and he hoped she was keeping warm. She was not, particularly. But she was surviving. Spring came to Thornmere Hall like a cautious guest, slowly, testing the air, not quite committing until late April, when the gardens suddenly decided in unison to bloom. Cecily was there to receive them. In the months since her arrival, she had done something that the hall's inhabitants had not quite believed possible. She had made it feel inhabited. The East Corridor was repaired and furnished simply with rugs from storage and candles placed at intervals so that the long walk to the library no longer felt like a passage through a forgotten wing. The kitchen garden produced early greens and herbs that reached the table fresh rather than arriving in jars from town at considerable expense. The 2 village women had brought a niece, who had a gift for bread, and the smell of baking drifted through the house on most mornings in a way that made the footmen stand a little straighter. There were also children. Cecily had discovered them almost by accident. 2 of the tenant farmers' families had children of school age with nowhere to send them, the nearest village school being a long winter walk across exposed moorland. She had organized nothing so grand as a school, but she had begun hosting 3 mornings a week in the old dairy room, which was warm and well lit and no longer used for its original purpose. She taught reading and arithmetic herself and hired the vicar's wife to come for 2 of the mornings and teach needlework and scripture, which the children mostly tolerated in exchange for the reading, which they loved. It was in the dairy room, on a Thursday morning in May, that Mrs. Pruitt found her, sitting on a low stool with a book of illustrated natural history open on her knee, surrounded by 7 children ranging from age 5 to 11. All of them leaning forward with the intensity of small animals presented with something excellent. Mrs. Pruitt stood in the doorway for a long moment. Then she went back to the kitchen and told the cook that she thought the Duchess might be something unexpected. The cook said she had suspected as much since the bread. The estate began to respond to attention the way neglected things do, not dramatically, but measurably. Hargreaves, given clear direction and genuine consultation, proved to be an excellent steward. The northern tenant dispute was resolved through a combination of patience and a very carefully drawn resurvey of the property boundary. The yield from the spring planting looked promising. Cecily rode the estate every Thursday morning on a sensible bay mare, which she had learned to manage with her usual practical determination, and she could now identify most of the families, most of the fields, and most of the problems by their proper names. She wrote to Edmund in June with the first complete seasonal accounts she had prepared. They showed a modest improvement in household expenditure, a projected increase in estate yield for the autumn, and the costs and outcomes of the school mornings. She included a note from one of the children, a 7-year-old named Peter Hargreaves, the steward's youngest, who had recently learned to write his own name and had produced, unsolicited, a small letter of greeting to the duck, which Cecily included without comment. Edmund's reply came faster than usual. He said the accounts were thorough and intelligently prepared. He said the school mornings were an unexpected initiative and he found he had no objection to them. He did not mention Peter Hargreaves's letter by name, but he enclosed, with no explanation, a box of colored pencils that arrived in the next post wagon. Cecily held the pencils for a long moment in the hall, rain moving steadily against the windows, the house warm around her with the smell of bread and wood smoke. She felt something she had not felt in months, something quiet and tentative, like the first warmth of an uncertain spring. She put the feeling away carefully, the way one puts away something one is not yet sure is safe to keep. He arrived in July without warning. He had written, certainly, a brief letter sent 3 days before his departure, which arrived, owing to the vagaries of the Northern Post, half a day before he did. Cecily was in the kitchen garden with her sleeves turned back and her hands in the earth when Mrs. Pruitt came to find her with an expression that suggested some emergency had occurred or was imminent. She had exactly enough time to wash her hands and change her dress before his carriage came up the drive. She stood on the front steps to receive him, because that was the appropriate thing to do, and she composed her face into the expression of a woman who is neither surprised nor dismayed. Which required some effort. Edmund descended from the carriage and stopped. He had expected, if he was honest, to find the hall much as he had left it. Perhaps slightly better managed, because his wife struck him from her letters as fundamentally capable. What he had not expected was what he saw when he looked up at Thornmere Hall, window boxes in the upper stories that had not existed in November. With late summer flowers that gave the stone facade an unfamiliar warmth. A front approach that had been cleared and re-gravelled and bordered with something low and flowering. The doors polished. The brass fittings bright in the July afternoon light. And on the steps, his wife, in a dress of soft green that was clearly her good dress and had been put on in some haste. With a slight flush of the garden still in her cheeks and her grey eyes composed and entirely unreadable. She said, "Your Grace. Welcome home." He said, "Cecily." And then he said nothing for a moment, because he was looking at the house, and the house looked nothing like the place he had left. Inside was stranger still. The east corridor had candles and rugs. The library had been opened and aired and contained, he noticed, the stack of the old head gardener's journals arranged beside his wife's own notebooks in handwriting that was small and precise. The drawing room had a fire lit and tea laid out, and through the open window, carried on the summer air, he could smell something that took him several seconds to identify as bread. He sat down in a house that smelled like a home. He was not, he realized, entirely certain how he felt about that. Dinner was the first test. They sat at opposite ends of a table that could have accommodated 20, which had seemed appropriately formal in November and now seemed merely absurd. Cecily had arranged things so that they could actually hear each other across the expanse of linen and silver, but she had not moved the settings closer together, and Edmund noticed that. And understood it as neither oversight nor invitation, but deliberate measurement. She spoke about the estate with the fluency of someone who knew it well. She spoke about Hargreaves and the autumn outlook with the confidence of someone who had made decisions about both. She asked his opinion where opinion was needed and did not ask it where she already had a clear view. He found himself listening with more attention than he had given to a dinner conversation in years. She did not ask him why he had come. She did not ask how long he was staying. She did not ask anything personal at all. She was polite and informed and absolutely, immovably correct in manner, and behind all of it, she was guarded. And he felt the guardedness the way one feels a wall that has been built in one's absence, not hostile, exactly, but real, and there for a reason. After dinner, when they had moved to the drawing room and she had made tea, she made it herself, still, he noticed, rather than leave it to the footman, he said. "You have done rather remarkable work here." She looked up. She said, "I have done what was necessary." There was a great deal that was necessary. The implication was gentle. But it was there. He said, "Yes. I see that." She handed him his tea and looked out the window at the evening garden and said nothing more. He stayed. He had told himself he would remain for a fortnight and reassess. By the end of the first week, he had stopped counting days. The estate required his attention, there were legal documents Hargreaves needed his signature upon. And a question about the northern boundary road that could only be settled by a personal inspection, and so he had legitimate reasons to stay that had nothing to do with the particular feeling of coming in from a morning on horseback and finding his wife in the library with her boots muddy and 3 notebooks open around her. Deep in something she would finish before she looked up. She always looked up. She always spoke to him. She was never cold. But she was never warm either, not in the way that would have made things easy. She was moderate, measured, and self-contained, and she treated him with the slightly elevated courtesy one might offer a guest one respected but did not entirely trust. He found it, unexpectedly, inexplicably, motivating. They rode the estate together on Thursday mornings, because that was her established routine and he inserted himself into it without asking, and she accepted his presence without comment. She knew things about the land that he did not. She knew which field had drainage problems and had sourced a possible solution from the old gardener's journals. She knew that the miller's wife was ill and that Hargreaves had quietly arranged for additional flour supply to be purchased at cost, and she had approved it. She knew the name of every child in the dairy room. He met Peter Hargreaves on his 4th day at the hall. The child regarded him with the frank assessment that only the very young and the very old manage honestly, and then said, "Are you the duck?" Edmund said that he was. Peter said, "She reads to us on Thursdays. Will you come?" Edmund said he would consider it. He came on the following Thursday. He sat in the back of the dairy room for an entire morning and watched his wife read illustrated natural history to 7 children in a voice that was quiet but absolutely confident. And he felt something shift inside him that he did not immediately have a name for. But then came the trouble, because August brings things besides warmth. A letter arrived from a Lord Keston, who owned the adjacent property to the east and who had been, Hargreaves informed Edmund with careful diplomatic phrasing, something of a difficulty. Keston had long coveted a strip of Thornmere land that bordered his own estate, a piece of moorland that was, in its current use, an access route for the northern tenant farms. He had previously approached Edmund's solicitors in London with an offer. The offer had been declined. He appeared to have concluded, from the Hall's long period of reduced occupation, that a renewed approach might meet with different results. His letter was addressed to Edmund. Its tone was that of a man who was confident he was speaking to someone who had not been paying close attention. Cecily appeared in the doorway of the study as Edmund was reading it for the second time. She said, "Mrs. Pruitt told me Lord Keston's post had arrived. I thought I might as well tell you, he has also written to me, separately, twice in the past 6 months. I declined both letters on behalf of the estate. I have copies in the second drawer of the writing desk if you would like to see them." Edmund looked up. She said, he proposed, in the second letter, that the tenant access road could be rerouted to avoid his proposed purchase. I had Hargreaves walk the alternative route. It would add 40 minutes to every journey from the northern farms, which in winter becomes rather significant. I said no. He said, "You said no." Yes. On behalf of the estate. On behalf of the tenants, primarily. The estate argument was also clear, but the tenant impact seemed more urgent. She paused. "I have managed well enough without direction in this matter, but I recognize it is rightfully your decision. I wanted you to understand the full situation before you replied to him." Edmund set the letter down. He looked at his wife, at the careful, composed expression that was both an offer and a boundary, that said, "This is yours to decide, but I have been here, and I have thought about it." He said, "I will write to Keston today. The land is not for sale." She said, "I think that is right," and withdrew. He wrote the letter and meant every word of it, and he was aware, as he wrote, that he was declining a lord's offer largely on arguments his wife had already constructed without him. The evening he found her crying, it was raining. Not unusual for the north in August, where the weather made no particular concessions to season or expectation. The rain had begun in the afternoon and settled in for the night, and Edmund had come down late for a book and found the study fire still burning and Cecily in the wingback chair nearest it. Not reading, her hands still in her lap, her face turned toward the window and the dark rain on the glass. He had started to withdraw. He was not sure why he didn't. She became aware of him after a moment. She straightened. She turned. She did not pretend she had not been crying, which he had half expected, but she also did not explain it, which he found he respected more than he could say. He said, "May I sit?" She said, "It is your house." He said, "That is not what I asked." A pause. Then, quietly, "Yes. You may sit." He sat in the opposite chair and watched the fire for a time. He said, without looking at her, "I owe you an explanation." For the manner of our arrangement. For the way things were presented to you. She said, you owe me nothing. We understood each other from the beginning. We did not. I understood what I needed. I did not consider what I was asking you to accept. The rain moved against the glass. She said, eventually, why did you choose me? He had known, since the first week at the hall, that this question would come, or should come, and he had not been certain he could answer it honestly. He said, because you were the only person in that room who was not trying to appear adequate. You simply were, or you were occupied with something else entirely. And I thought, he stopped. He said, I was very tired. I thought someone who had no interest in impressing me might be someone I could stand to be near. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, that is a terrible reason to choose a wife. Yes, he said. I know that now. Another silence. Then she said, the war. Was it very bad? He had not spoken of it to anyone. He had returned from the campaign and immediately assumed the duties of the dukedom, which had offered, among its inconveniences, the considerable relief of having something else to attend to. He said, yes. Then, because she had asked directly and had earned a direct answer, I lost men under my command who should not have been lost. I made decisions I cannot undo. I came home and I was given a title and a house and a ledger of debts, and I found that I preferred the ledger. At least it had clear answers. She said, and people do not. No. People do not. She looked at the fire. She said, I was not crying about the arrangement. I want you to know that. I was thinking about my mother, who died 3 years ago. She would have, Cecily stopped, and her voice was quite controlled when she continued, she would have liked this place. She would have liked the garden, and she would have loved the children in the dairy room. I was thinking that I wished I could tell her. He felt the weight of what she had not said, that she was lonely, not broken, that she grieved but was not defeated. That she had built something beautiful out of something cold and impersonal and she had done it alone. And she had done it for herself and for the tenants and for 7 children who now knew their letters, and she had done none of it for him. He said, she would have been proud of you. Cecily looked at him. Something moved in her face, unguarded, brief, real. She said, thank you, Edmund. It was the first time she had used his name. The letter from London came in September. It was a parliamentary summons, urgent and formally phrased, requiring the Duke of Thornmere's attendance within the fortnight on a matter of legislation involving northern land rights, the very legislation that touched on estates like his. Edmund read it with the particular resignation of a man who has temporarily forgotten that the rest of the world does not observe the rhythms of a kitchen garden and a dairy room school. He showed it to Cecily. She read it without expression and handed it back and said, you should go. He said, I know. She said, the autumn yields will be in while you are in London. I will forward the accounts. He said, Cecily, she said, the school mornings continue through October. I have already arranged with the vicar's wife for November. She was listing things, he understood, because it was safer than the alternative. He had seen her do it before. It was how she organized herself against feelings that threatened to be larger than she had room for. He left on a Monday. The morning was cool and brilliant, the moorland gilded with early autumn, and she stood on the steps again as she had in July. And this time he stopped in front of her before descending to the carriage, and he held out his hand. She looked at it. She put her hand in his. He said, I will return before the first frost. She said, the first frost in the north arrives at its own discretion. He looked at her for a moment, the gray eyes, the composed face. The hand small and warm in his, and he said, then I will return quickly. He was not in London 3 days when the letter from Keston arrived, forwarded to him by Hargreaves. Keston had taken Edmund's refusal not as a conclusion but as an opening, and had written, through his own solicitors, to suggest that as the Thornmere estate apparently required a duchess to manage it in the Duke's absence, there were questions about the Duke's competency to retain the Northern Territory under current land legislation. It was a legal threat, and it was thin, but it was designed to create enough complexity to force a settlement. Edmund's solicitors were alarmed. Edmund was not alarmed. He was angry, in the clean, focused way of a man who has been reminded what matters and does not intend to allow it to be threatened. He wrote 2 letters the same afternoon. One to his solicitors, giving clear instruction, and one to Cecily. The letter to Cecily was not brief. He told her about Keston's move. He told her she should be aware of any approach Keston's people might make locally. He told her, and here his pen slowed, and he considered, and then he wrote it anyway, that whatever Keston believed, the fact that the Thornmere estate was well managed in his absence was not a weakness but the clearest possible evidence of its strength, and that the strength was not his. He said, "The strength is yours. I want you to know I understand that." Her reply reached him 6 days later. It said, Keston's men came to the village. He spoke to 2 of the tenant farmers, neither of whom told him anything he did not already know, because they are loyal people who have been fairly treated. I spoke with Hargreaves. I have written a letter to your solicitors outlining the precise terms of the tenant road arrangement, which I believe is material to the legal question. I hope this is useful. The first frost held off longer than expected. The garden looks very well. Peter Hargreaves has begun reading to the younger children on his own, which I think is something you would have liked to see. Cecily. He read it 3 times. Then he sent his solicitors her letter about the tenant road arrangement and told them it was the core of their argument. It was. The case collapsed within a fortnight. Keston withdrew. The northern land stayed with Thornmere. Edmund came home in October, before the frost. He arrived in the early evening, when the light was low and amber and the smell of wood smoke was already rising from the hall's chimneys, and the garden was bronze and gold with autumn. And a child, Peter Hargreaves, specifically, was sitting on the front step reading aloud to himself from a small blue book, and looked up at the carriage with perfect composure and said, "She's in the library. She's been there all afternoon. I think she was waiting." Edmund stopped. He said, "Were you waiting too?" Peter considered. "I was reading. But also waiting." He returned to his book with diplomatic efficiency. Cecily was in the library. She was standing at the window, looking out at the evening garden, and she turned when she heard him. And for a moment they simply looked at each other across the length of a room that smelled of paper and old wood and autumn, and the fire was going in the grate, and the candles were already lit. He had carried with him, all the way from London, the knowledge of what he wanted to say. In London it had seemed clear. In this room, with her eyes grey and steady and guarded, it became instead something he had to say precisely, because she deserved precision. He said, "I have been thinking, since July, about what I asked you to accept. Not what I offered you very little. What I asked you to accept." She said, "Edmund, no. Please let me." He moved into the room, not far, just far enough to be clearly in it. "I asked you to come to a house that was cold and managed and not a home, and to accept a marriage that was a contract and not a partnership, and to be adequate at a distance. And instead he stopped. He said, instead you made it into something. You made it into a place where children read by candlelight and the bread smells of something worth coming home to, and the tenants trust their duchess, and the garden blooms. And a 7-year-old boy reads on the front steps in the autumn and doesn't find anything strange about that. You did all of it. Without me. With almost nothing from me." She was very still. He said, "I chose you in October because you were not performing for me. I did not know then what you were instead. I know now. You were attending to what actually mattered. You have been doing that since before I ever looked at you across a tea table." He said, "I was wrong about the arrangement. I was wrong about what I owed you. I was wrong about," he paused. He said, quietly, "I think I was wrong to believe that the right way to survive was alone." She looked at him for a long moment. Something in the careful architecture of her composure shifted, not collapsed, not broke, but moved, the way a door moves when someone finally chooses to open it. She said, "You were in considerable pain. Pain makes people efficient. It is not the same as being right." He said, "No. It is not." She said, "I could not tell, when you left in November, whether you chose me because you thought I was the least likely to trouble you or because you saw something you thought was real. It mattered to me. It mattered more than I wished it did." He said, "It was real. I simply did not know what I was seeing yet." She crossed the room. Not all the way, she left 3 feet between them, because she was still herself and she would not rush this, but she held out her hand, the way he had in September, and he took it, and she said, "Then perhaps we might begin again. Properly this time." He said, "I should very much like that." She said, "You should know that I intend to continue the school mornings." He said, "I was hoping you would let me attend them." Something broke open in her face then, not grief, not relief, but something that contained both and was better than either, something that looked, he thought, remarkably like joy, if joy were the careful, certain, earned kind. The fire settled in the grate. Outside, the autumn garden held its colors in the last of the light. Somewhere in the hall, a child finished reading his chapter and went home to supper. Edmund raised his wife's hand and held it for a moment, and then, quite deliberately, he turned it and pressed his lips to her knuckles, and looked at her above the gesture, and she did not look away. She said, "Come and have tea." He said, "Yes." And then, because he was a man learning to say the things that mattered, "There is nowhere else I want to be." She poured the tea herself. As she always did, with steady hands and full attention. And he sat beside her in the warm library of Thornmere Hall and thought of the October drawing room where he had first watched her across the rim of a teacup and known, with the unexplainable certainty of things that turn out to be true, that she was the one. He had not understood why, then. He understood now. He had chosen the woman pouring the tea because she was the only person in the room who was fully, completely, honestly present. Not performing. Not hoping. Simply there, attending to what mattered. He had chosen better than he knew. And she, who had accepted a cold arrangement with steady hands and made it into a warm and living thing, had loved better than he deserved. But she loved him still. He could see it in the way she handed him his cup. In the way she sat close enough to be companionable, and said, over the rim of her own tea, "The garden will need winter preparation by next week. I thought you might help." He said, "I thought you might teach me." She smiled. It was the first time he had seen her smile fully, not politely, not carefully, but fully, with her whole face, and it was not the smile of a woman who had survived, though she had. It was the smile of a woman who had arrived somewhere she had built herself and found, against considerable probability, that she did not have to be alone in it. Outside, the first frost came softly in the night, and the garden held, because it had been tended, and the hall was warm. And the Duke of Thornmere sat beside his Duchess in the firelight and learned to be present in a life he had very nearly allowed to become only an arrangement. The quiet woman who had poured the tea had, in the end, poured it into something that ran clear and deep and permanent. And they were, at last, home. That was the story of Cecily and the Duke of Thornmere, two people who began with a cold arrangement and ended with something warm, honest, and entirely earned. If this story moved you, we would love for you to let us know in the comments which moment stayed with you most. And if you know someone who loves a slow burn historical romance built on quiet strength and hard-won love, please share this with them. Subscribe to join us for our next story, because there is always another woman waiting at the edge of history, doing the quiet, necessary, extraordinary work of making something out of very little. We will be here to tell her story. We always will.